We have here Aditi Joshi, who's a machine learning specialist from Google Cloud. We have Neema Kaseje, who's a humanitarian surgeon, and Oriana Kraft, who is the founder of FemTechnology.org. So why are we here? We're talking about bridging the, and I love the sound of my voice too. Here we go. Yeah, very exciting. So we're talking about, what is gender health data, right? It is the quality and the quantity of data that we have about women's health, and what we don't know about women's bodies is quite extraordinary. And I think that people are really super shocked because they think if it's really such a big problem, which it is, why hasn't it been solved? We know that it's only since 1993 that women have been sort of mandated to be in clinical trials, but we still see that their representation in these trials and also the representation of all the intersections of women, all the different kind of classes and ethnicities and ages are not represented. We know that translational research takes 17 years to go from the sort of the research lab to the bedside. So if you're thinking that this conversation of research only started in 1993, we talk about it being the adolescent period of what we know about women's health. To add to that, we know that most of the research is still done on male mice. So that adds, it's a very interesting kind of problem. So we're going to sort of go, we have really a fabulous, well-rounded panel. So I'm going to start off with you, Oriana, if you don't mind just giving us a little bit of a landscape about, how you started in this and the whole FemTechnology conversation.
Yeah, so I started the first FemTechnology Summit studying medicine at ETH Zurich, and it was more that, to be honest, I was under the naive impression that women and men were getting equal quality of care. I think when you grow up in Switzerland, the healthcare system is really pretty great. And so I thought, logical. I feel like an equal citizen. Obviously, I'm getting the same treatment. And it wasn't until the third year of medical school that actually the notion of sex and gender-based differences in medicine was introduced. And it was introduced actually in the context of mice, of mouse models. They said, okay, there are sex differences in every single cell in the human body. And I thought, okay, great. We've had 3 years of medical school learning about diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all of that, and it wasn't mentioned. And it still isn't really integrated into clinical care today. So there's actually a study that came out just a couple of months ago that said that they estimate that as many as 35,000 women in the UK are missing out on a diabetes diagnosis because the threshold, the cutoff level is too high for premenopausal women because you're losing sort of blood cells when you menstruate, and that wasn't taken into account. They didn't factor in the fact that, so there's a lot of women getting diagnosed with diabetes post-menopause when they could have actually been caught a lot early and improve outcomes in the long term just because these sort of fundamental differences aren't taken into account. And I had no idea about endometriosis, about PCOS. These are diseases that impact 10% of the population, and we still don't really have effective diagnostics or therapeutics for. And ETH really is trying to sort of shape the future of medicine, but there wasn't a whole lot being paid attention to in terms of what innovation is occurring. But that's slowly starting to change, I think, with sort of conversations like these, and with innovative sort of femtech startups that are sort of actually leveraging human biology to collect novel information. So an example that I love is there's a bra actually out of MIT that is trying to collect cardiovascular biomarkers because we know that women are actually 50% more likely to die from a heart attack because the way women present is different, but many people don't actually know about that symptomatic different presentation. And so they're slowly but surely it's changing. Yeah, I don't know.
That's a great beginning. That's our landscape. And we're gonna go to Neema now, who is a practitioner.
Yes.
In low resource settings as well as very high resource settings, and how does this play out in a practitioner environment?
So I've focused my career basically in humanitarian settings, and most recently in Kakuma refugee camp. Just last year, we reached the devastating milestone of 100 million displaced people as a result of conflict, as a result of climate disasters. And we're seeing those things worsen, and it's women and children who flee. 70% of those who are displaced are women and children, very vulnerable. Poverty is really high, and they basically have zero access to health services, and they're not really counted, because they are in this very difficult context with no infrastructure, with no voice. And so that's where I'm practicing right now. And the point I'd like to make is that, technology is great, and I love technology, but there's some basic things, basic fundamental things in under-resourced areas, particularly in rural areas and in refugee contexts, that are not in place. For example, simple running water, or electricity, and those basic things need to also be addressed, in addition to adding on technology such as AI. So women are very vulnerable in these contexts. They're the ones fleeing. They're the ones that make up the 100 million that are fleeing conflict and climate disasters. And they're not counted for. And when you don't count people, then you cannot intervene, and you cannot plan what needs to be done. And so that lack of data results in lack of action.
So this invisibility of data, so we look at the developed world where we're not counting women or anybody but white men, basically. Yeah. And we look at the intersections in the developing world where the most vulnerable, the most marginalized among us, who are really even more invisible in this data, this negative space times machine learning, AI, sort of negative times negative, becomes this codified space of invisibility. So Aditi, you're our machine learning expert. How does this play out, this lack of data in that way?
Yeah, so just to give you background, I work in the machine learning space at Google Cloud, and we work in a middleware system in the sense that the top is just working with machine learning frameworks like PyTorch, JAX, and TensorFlow. And we're building the middleware that'll be able to talk to the different servers that can actually crunch the data, like NVIDIA, Intel, AMD. So we have an open source ecosystem that's out there, and what we're trying to do is streamline the ability to be able to develop and deploy these machine learning models in a very efficient manner, because it's very expensive to crunch all of this data. And then the other problem is that we just heard this data from women's health perspective is actually missing. Right, so what machine learning models do is they just amplify that bias, and then that inequity just keeps growing and growing and growing. So we should probably talk about solutions at some point in time, but all we're saying is that this new world that we're living in, where we're moving exponentially, the biases will only get amplified as a result of it if we don't address this issue head on. And that's why this panel is so important today, and to make sure that we're creating that awareness within the wider population, especially with the medical community and the academics and the practitioners, that this exists, and then put implementation plans in place to make sure that we're starting to collect that information so that that information can go into those models and that we can reduce that bias and that amplification can be reduced as well.
Yeah, fabulous. So we're going to do one quick round of challenges, and then we're going to go into 2 rounds of opportunities. So we're going to leave you with really great hope. But I think we still need to set a bit more of the stage. So I'd like to start with you, Oriana, about what you think the greatest challenge is to gathering this data. I think let's talk about getting the data first.
I mean, I think Aditi touched on it really nicely. I think the first challenge, first and foremost, is kind of awareness. I mean, it's still today, women are not, like the quantitative and qualitative data is still not systematically being collected. So an example is there was a large-scale cancer center that was running brachytherapies for both prostate cancer and cervical cancer, which are deemed more or less equivalent. And they asked 9 out of 10 men about sort of their sexual dysfunction post, cancer treatment, and they asked 1 out of 10 women. So we're not like systematically collecting that data in the same way, and from a qualitative perspective. And from a quantitative perspective, in phase 1 clinical trials, women still only account for 22% of participants, still today. And I mean, there's some just really ridiculous stories. For example, like Aditi is, so there are 27 drugs on the market for sexual dysfunction for men and only 2 for women. And of those 2, they wanted to test what the interaction with alcohol was. And they tested it on 23 men and 2 women. And this is purely a drug which is for women, right? So it's just, I mean, the first step is just awareness and talking about the fact that there are just some basic fundamental principles that should be in place. But yeah, I mean, well, okay, we're not supposed to launch into opportunities yet. Yeah.
Well, keep that thought. Let's just go to the challenges, and then we can be really positive at the end. So, Neema, challenges in your environment.
In my environment, it's life and death. We're still in survival mode, and so gathering data is not at the top of our priority list because we're still just trying to survive, just to have the basics of water, of electricity, of having the supplies, the medicines. I still have to carry, sutures in my backpack when I go to make sure that I can do the surgeries that I need to do. So really is survival, and in order for survival to happen, we need peace. We need to also take into account, the climate disasters and build resilience. We need to address poverty. So those things also need to be taken into account in order to be in an environment that we can actually move away from our survival mode to gathering data, to being strategic about how we implement things, how we measure things, and how we respond to that data.
Right. Okay, we can talk about the integration of, in a low-resource environment, about how data might be gathered, but maybe that's the opportunity. Yeah. What is, in terms of how do we get the data into the system?
So I think this is like a shared responsibility. So we really need to make sure that we're working with governments and we're working with the private sector, we're working with clinicians and physicians to make sure we're streamlining the process as much as possible and making it as easy for physicians to be able to collect this information so that we can take the data and then we can crunch it in the back end and we can produce the results that they're looking for so that they can start offering more personalized medicine. But the critical part is, number one, making it as easy for physicians as possible to be able to, and like empowering them and enabling them to collect that data in a way that doesn't stop them from doing what they need to do as a physician. So I want to work with you more, actually, to figure out how to make that happen.
Absolutely, and that'll bring us, I think, to a little bit the quantitative, also the qualitative, which you have some very interesting things to say, and interoperability, which we'll get to. So now, here we are. We've gone over challenges so quickly. Oriana, what are some of the opportunities here?
Well, so I think part of the problem with this, right, is the lack of prioritization of women's health needs in the system, and that exists very much in medical school. So actually, menopause, which all women will go through, is still an elective in medical school, right? So it's only estimated that in the UK, for example, 41% of physicians have had any training whatsoever to do with menopause. And then we kind of wonder why there's this, it's estimated that it costs the US economy 1.8 billion, sort of this mismanagement of menopause. It has a tremendous burden on the economy, and it's not being, like providers on the front line are not actually equipped to handle it because there's not adequate time allotted. To your point about we can't burden physicians more, right? They don't have, you can't expect them to be proactive and learning this treatment, but I think that's where kind of, AI offers a really interesting opportunity, because for things like endometriosis, which take an average of 7 years to be diagnosed, we actually know what some of the really fundamental like baseline symptoms are that could be flagged early. So if like a teenage girl presents with terrible period pain or vomiting, instead of dismissing it as, oh, she's just being dramatic or whatever, the system could flag it, right? Could say you might want to refer her to a specialist who could screen it and who could handle it in more detail. Same thing sort of for cardiovascular disease. It presents differently in men and women. And so if the system knew to, okay, this is a woman, she's of a certain age, she has these other risk factors, and she's presenting with these symptoms, you may want to flag it. You're not putting that burden on the physician to have that level of medical knowledge, right? I mean, they deal with thousands and thousands of conditions. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity, is sort of this integration of this knowledge and evidence that we already have. And then I think it's sort of the opportunity to study new things. So I think there's this period tracking app called Clue that I really like because it's been using sort of something quite basic, which is the menstrual cycle, but hasn't really been studied, and looking at what are sort of correlations with other symptoms and doing collaborations with research institutes to sort of see what can we find out, what can we better understand about female physiology. So I think AI can be a really powerful equalizer. It can allow more people to study more things. It doesn't require as much like sign off and resource allocation. More people can like take interesting. Yeah, I think it can reprioritize women, to be honest. But I think part of the problem is a lot of the times women are not the ones leading these research projects either, right? So in the context of this is a little bit different, but Viagra, for example, when they first started studying it, it was originally to look at whether it could help with cardiovascular disease. They found it had two interesting applications. One was quite well known, right, for erectile dysfunction. The other was to help with menstrual cramps. For context, I think erectile dysfunction impacts something like 15% of men, and it's estimated that around 90% of women at some point will have really bad menstrual cramps. But the researchers who were researching this, they didn't understand the potential application. They didn't think that the market size was big enough, and so they dismissed it, right? And it still hasn't been kind of looked into as much. So I think if you have if you give people tools and you allow a more diverse like population set to look into these interesting correlations, I think that that's where the opportunity is in the context of AI. But still, I think the skill set, the people who have the skill set currently are not necessarily women at this moment in time.
Yeah. Neema?
So in terms of opportunities, I think leveraging technology can help us overcome some of the barriers that we have. So one area where I can see AI and technology really helping us in our particular context is our lack of a workforce. So for instance, we don't have radiologists in the hospital that I work in. So we could use AI to get diagnoses, and acquire the images, transmit the images, and get someone else to read them remotely so that we can quickly get the diagnosis and help the patient. So that's one area where I think there is a lot of potential to really overcome some of the barriers that we have in our particular health system. But I do also have some concerns in terms of, well, what were the inputs to get to the AI, and do those inputs include us as stakeholders in the process? Because if we're using that solution and we had nothing to do with it at the beginning, how will that solution apply to us, and does it fit with our particular context? And you talked about biases, and that's really, really important, because who's represented in that output, that AI output? Does it also include the refugee women? Does it include Black women? Does it include African women? And so if we're not there at the beginning, how does that end solution apply to us? So those are some of the things that I think we need to think critically about right now. But technology in itself is a game changer and can help us leapfrog some of the barriers that we are facing right now. But at the same time, we need to be careful. We need to make sure that it is inclusive. We need to make sure that there's adequate representation. We need to also look at the ethics around AI and make sure that vulnerable populations are protected and are given also the tools to be able to use these new technologies. And it shouldn't be, well, we're doing all of this and then we'll just drop it and you take, we want you to take on this solution and figure out how it will work for you.
Right. Well, I think this is a design, I just want to say it's a design problem, right? So we really who are the collaborators?
Yeah.
There's the community engagement, it's the data from the community, but it's also community design, what the community needs. In your case, when you're working in a refugee camp, what is useful there, not what does somebody lovingly in Zurich think would be good in a refugee camp, and then also the practitioners and the community health workers as well, right? So it's all down the ecosystem. So it's not also the domain experts in your setting, but it's also sort of the women health workers and the mothers and the children all together. And this is a big design. This is actually kind of news to the tech community, isn't it? We've discussed this. They're not really reaching out to collaborate and co-design solutions. So
I think that is a shared responsibility, right? I think just to highlight, making sure that we reduce your burden, I think is very important. Something like radiology is if you don't have radiologists, that's something that's very easy from a machine learning model perspective to be able to help predict if someone has a particular tumor or not. So that we can definitely help with. And then prioritization, I want to add to what you said. It's really important because right now it's just not prioritized because the people who are designing these studies aren't necessarily women. And understanding things like menstrual cramps or menopause is not something that's top of mind for them because they are not their problems. So prioritization of collecting that information is going to be incredibly important. Getting more women involved and trained in machine learning is going to be really critical. So making sure that the reskilling, that upskilling happens. We can definitely streamline and burden some of the concerns that you have. So it's designed to help in the context that you're working in. And then the other part is you can also use things like synthetic data, right? So synthetic data is something to think about as well because from a data privacy and security perspective, it helps to protect the vulnerable population because women's health is very personal to us. It's not something that you want a random person or a hacker to find out about and then to broadcast to the world, right? It's not something that you want to do. So synthetic data can help to address some of those concerns as well from a data privacy security perspective. That's number one. But number two, we can also put out different things in the field like watches, like a Pixel Watch or Apple, like the watch, Apple Watch, for example, that can help collect this information. And then academic institutions like Stanford, I was part of the biodesign program at Stanford. We have an open source kit called SPEZI. It used to be called Cardinal Kit that actually is available to any academic researcher if that's something that's of interest to them, to be able to collect that information. So we work really closely with the Apple Health team, and on the back end, it's Google Cloud and some of the machine learning models that put in place to be able to crunch that data. So to be able to get all those things out there in the field, to be able to collect that information so that we can crunch it in the back end using Google Cloud's like machine learning models, that's something for us to think about as well. And that's combined with synthetic data, right, from a data privacy security perspective.
So I have two questions. One is the open source. So that data that Apple Watch is then collecting, is that then going back into a commons, a data commons, where researchers can use that?
I'd love to, like, if someone has questions about that, reach out to me and I'll send you all the links. It's something that the Stanford team has been working on for many, many years now, and they've made a huge amount of progress. It's part of the biodesign team at Stanford. So I'm happy to send that to you all. It's all open source. Everyone is welcome. There's a class that happens every quarter. It's actually kicking off next week, and they have different research projects that they work on. So if anyone is interested, please reach out, and I'll put you in touch with those researchers. And there's students as well at Stanford that major in computer science that are working on helping to collect that information and crunch that data in the background.
Right. But also those are people who have Apple Watches, right? So they're not necessarily people in the refugee camps. So it's still a subset of the world, right?
Exactly.
So we know that it's only a certain socioeconomic group of people that are being collected. I have another question, then I'm going to go to you about synthetic data. If you're just adding to a data set, but you don't have, for example, women of color or men of color in the data set, you can synthesize it. You can't just like dump in what you don't have. Is that just correct?
No,
okay. All right. So we need to collect.
Well, there's a lot of opportunity there, but we still have to address those challenges that we talked about initially.
Right. So we need that base in order for us to build up and augment a little bit. Do you have another opportunity that you are a reaction to something somebody said? Oriana.
I mean, I think just to highlight that it's a huge economic opportunity. I think a lot of times with women's health, the case is made that it is the right thing to do and it is the moral thing to do. And it is, right? I mean, it's actually more than 50% of the population, but that hasn't gotten us very far in the conversation, to be honest. This is a little bit of a tangent, but people have realized the value of women's health data when it comes to fertility. There was a scandal where fertility tracking apps were selling the data to like groups like Facebook and all that because they thought, oh, actually we can target them with ads. We can make a lot of money off of women who are trying to get pregnant or who are pregnant. We can sell them a shit ton of stuff. This is great for us. So when it comes to women's health, when there's money to be made, people are interested. And there was just recently, actually at the World Economic Forum, 2 days ago, McKinsey launched a report that estimated that the innovation in women's health is upwards of a $1 trillion opportunity. I mean, I think it's actually a lot more. The problem is, like, we don't actually have the data. This is just with the data they have, they were able to estimate that it's worth that much. So there's tremendous room for innovation, there's tremendous room for research, there's tremendous room for solutions, and there's tremendous room to make, like, a lot of money. And in Davos, I think that's usually what moves the conversation forward. And I think the other thing that I found really interesting was when I talked to a researcher who said, hey, up until now, basically, we've only studied men, and we've unlocked tremendous scientific innovations. I think we're all happy to be alive in this day and age where we're not dying at 35 because we have no antibiotics. But imagine what answers or questions we could find if we started studying women. This is like a total different population set, different opportunities to unlock. I think it's really interesting. The ovary is the fastest aging organ in the human body. You have all these billionaires who want to delay aging for forever, but there's now a growing conversation starting to say, actually, the ovary might be the key to unlocking and understanding aging, because it is the fastest aging organ in the human body, so what could we understand? So yeah, I mean, it's from a science perspective, it's just really interesting. You have this huge, huge population and huge potential data set that we've just literally never looked into.
Exactly. 50% of the population, but also we also see that 80% of the men of the sort of majority world, the majority world has been left out, men and women too. So do you see some more? I know that it's a difficult resource environment, but that technology is coming fast, whether it's a refugee camp or not. Do you see another kind of opportunity?
So I think, as I mentioned earlier, it needs to be a two-pronged approach. So we need to still get the basics in place in terms of infrastructure, equipment, and all of the health workforce, and then leverage technology to accelerate our progress. But we can't bring in AI and not have water. That's not going to be helpful. So it needs to be a two-pronged approach. I think also we need to think about systems. We need to think about, well, what needs to happen at the systemic level, so that a lot of the data collection becomes automatic, and it's done with ease, and the data is protected. So those are some of the things we need to think about. We need to think about health policies that need to be in place to make it possible to really bridge this data gap that we're seeing right now. We need to look into laws. What are the laws in place, protecting women and children, and can we keep the governments accountable? And what indicators are we going to use to measure our progress? That's also really important, so that we can have accountability across different stakeholders. We should also look at, we mentioned research and the fact that women are not involved, they're not principal investigators, they're not getting the funds, so they're not at the table and they're not leading. So how do we get more women leaders in the field of science, in the field of research? And that needs to begin in kindergarten, needs to begin very early on to get us at the table, in the room, and leading these trials. So those are other things that we also need to take into account, so that we're not just continuing with things that have been in place since our great-grandparents. So we need to really change from a transgenerational perspective, change who's doing the research, who's collecting the data, who's setting the priorities and the agenda, and go from there.
And that goes to this co-design approach, because
Absolutely.
I don't think we can wait till women have sort of entered in greater numbers. They're only in about 22% in machine learning or in parliaments or whatever. So as we're achieving parity in that way, I mean, one of this co-design ideas is also that you would bring women experts and sector experts onto your teams. Mm-hmm. And you don't necessarily need a machine learning expert to be designing a medical solution. You can take a female medical doctor and a female participant. Just want to go to the radiology example, because we've been looking with a human rights-based approach. We already have these laws in place, right?
Yeah.
And we already have these kind of, at least conceptual ability to understand how things should be ethical and should be responsible. But in radiology, like, who is like the client? Who's the user? Is it the hospital? Is it the is it the radiologist? Is it the internist that's going to be, or the oncologist that's going to be talking about it? Is it the patient? Yeah.
Actually, just to add to that, though, it wasn't until 2016 that it was mandated. So it was still like a nice to have, women included in clinical trials. Women were excluded until 1993, and then it was, and then it was a nice to have, right?
Yeah.
And then in 2016, they were like, hey,
It's
no,
the law.
you need some women.
Yeah.
It's actually, you'd be surprised. The law doesn't really include it to this day.
Right. And we've been working, and I think they may have just changed it with the Lancet, because we were like, who's in charge of global health, right? So people do things for these great, fabulous journals. So we had been asking them already 7 years ago to go from recommend to require. We said it's not even a whole, you can even keep the first beginning of the word. You know, it's just one word. If you had required that there would be gender disaggregated data, things would change. Can I just ask one more thing about the COVID statistics? Do you have that at the top of your head? Okay, I'm going to look it up.
Something like
I have
only 8% in COVID trials actually disaggregated, like actually had sex disaggregated data, which is like, it's so easy, right? It would be so easy to implement that, but people just don't routinely want to look into it. And I actually had a conversation with a researcher once who said that there are a lot of pharma companies who actually know that it doesn't, that there are these differences in how it performs, but they don't want to like have their market size. So they would rather have something that kind of like works less well in both men and women than have something that performs super well in only half the population, which I think is an interesting perspective. But yeah.
Aditi.
No, I'm still excited about the opportunity. I think this is exponential growth here. Just the fact that we can have synthetic data, the fact that there's different privacy mechanisms in place, things like federated learning, differential privacy, that can help protect the privacy of this information is incredibly important. And the fact that we can actually crunch this information and deliver personalized medicine, that's the other opportunity as well, right? Because now it's going to be about drug design and not about drug discovery anymore. So I think we're at we're like at a threshold. And so let's make sure that more women are leading some of the design of these experiments, and they're being upskilled and reskilled. Because if you feel that pain point, right, because if you've got those menstrual cramps, if you're dealing with menopause, all of a sudden you factor that into the way that you're collecting that information. So I think that upskilling and the reskilling of the workforce, especially in women, around machine learning is going to be incredibly important. And then let's leverage things like synthetic data to be able to get the information that we need so we can truly deliver personalized medicine. So I'm still very excited, and I'm bullish on what we're about to do. And the fact that we're having this panel at Davos, that just tells you that that awareness is definitely there. But I think we just all need to be very vocal about it and create more and more awareness so that people can start collecting this information.
So let's go back to basics now. How are we going to collect this information? Do you want to start on your end? Is like, where are we going to get the data from? How are we going to?
I mean, I think with a lot of femtech startups, they're saying that they're sort of crowdsourcing the data from women. So like I mentioned, the bra that's collecting cardiovascular biomarkers to sort of see, or they're digital biomarkers that we could see in women and how it presents in a way that's like actually, you know, people are wearing bras anyway. It's not like an extra invasive procedure. There's a company called Evie who's been sequencing the vaginal microbiome, and they've discovered strains that actually nobody knew about before because nobody bothered to study the vaginal microbiome, and they did that with like an at-home test. I mean, I mentioned Clue, which is leveraging sort of like people tracking the symptoms that they're experiencing in correlation with their menstrual cycle. I'm actually quite optimistic on sort of citizen science, so collecting like large swaths of data and then collaborations with research institutions to sort of parse the data and look at what we already know, what we don't know. Yeah.
Data collection opportunities where you are, where that obviously isn't the highest priority, but are there?
So we've been pretty successful collecting data through community health workers. So I worked with about 1,000 community health workers in rural Kenya who were able to digitally collect household level data from 300,000 households, and we did that during COVID-19 to ensure that every household had a hand washing point, to ensure that that they knew about how to prevent, how to identify, and how to also identify severe cases. And with that, the community health worker level data, the data they collected was actually of high quality and was validated by Ministry of Health data sets as well. So that's one workforce that we can deploy to get population level data very quickly and get key insights from households. There are also data sets that are routinely collected by the Ministry of Health and underutilized. So in Kenya, for instance, we have the District Health Information System. So that's data that's collected at the hospital level for every single person that comes into the hospital. But it's important not to have just hospital level data. You also need community level data because it's only a subset of the population that will reach the hospital. So it's important to have both. So there are a lot of opportunities, especially if you look at a specific context and what assets they have. In Kenya, we have this community health worker network, and they are closely connected with every household. And that's something that we've been able to leverage successfully to get household level data.
And that's also something that we've been missing, right? The qualitative aspect of the data in
Yes.
terms of health. It's all been, sort of this whole technology being isolated and
Yeah.
siloed and sort of reifying the quantitative, but the qualitative, especially in the health data,
Yeah.
is going to be really also a game changer.
Yeah.
Also this interoperability potentially of governments
Yeah.
who already are sitting on all this really big data.
Yeah, so there's hospital data sets that are out there. That's something that we need to find out more about because there's a lot that we can do with that just through data cleaning and applying models around that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're having this.
Yes. Well, we're going to take this
Conversation.
offline. But we're going to be very Swiss. We're going to be exactly on time here. So we're talking about lots of things. First of all, this idea of pattern recognition is we're going to be able to maybe look at new issues, new correlations, and this is really something that AI is really fabulous about when we're talking about endometriosis and these presentations that doctors haven't really been able to pick up until now, starting with medical school curriculums, which we'd really like to change. We'd also like to change the medical textbooks, right, which only have pictures. Basically, it's 61% of, it's all pictures of men, right? Then we want to just course correct, because if we don't gather the data now, we're not going to be able to actually use the AI, the machine learning, in the way that it's really going to be helpful. So we're at a sort of a crossroads now. It's either if we don't start collecting and start talking about this, we're going to just really go into bad medicine for the majority world and women. That's like 80% of the world. Or we can start looking at this as a 21st century opportunity of new scientific excellence, new discovery, and we can all be in this together. But the change is really to be asking all the others of the world, who are really the majority of the entire world, to sort of participate and ask them and bring them in. And there we are, exactly on time. What do you think about that? All right, so, thank you.
Thank you.